The heaven of Marx's world is communism. And it looks almost like all other utopias in a way. It's like people are free to roam and write poetry. And the problem is not the state, it's not capitalism, it's man. The problem is men are sinful. Men are not these enlightened beings just ready to break out and become poets once they all have equal amounts of money. We do not find value alone as beings. We find it because others bear witness to our suffering. They bear witness to our tragedy, to our meaning, to our successes.
Welcome to the Brad Carr Podcast. My guest is Robert Orlando, documentary filmmaker and author of Karl Marx, The Divine Tragedy. Robert Orlando, who would you say Karl Marx was, and what was the core insight of his work?
Who was Karl Marx? Karl Marx was a combination of a prophet disguised as an economist, political theorist, and I would say his key work was Das Kapital, that I think he was writing for his entire life and never completed it.
Yeah. You think that's bigger than the Communist Manifesto or the Manifesto of the Communist Party?
Yeah, by far.
Really? Because that's the one that I hear more about.
His life work. Communist Manifesto was like an early track when they were trying to provoke revolution in the 1848.
So what was he trying to do with Das Kapital?
Well, one of the reasons I wrote the book, part of my interest in the book was that I thought of it always as just an economical exploration. I thought of him as an economist or a political theorist, and he is those things too. But what I learned from one other author is that he saw Das Kapital as almost a divine comedy in the way that Dante takes you through a series of virtuous phases of man's development and things like that. But what he was trying to do, Marx, is do it in a materialist way. He was trying to take the world in a moral quest to think differently about the evolution of man and how this happened, but he did it through economic and materialist terms. So it's more the quest of a prophet, like a Jeremiah or an Isaiah writing, but using materialist language to do it.
So in that version of the world, what does a heaven look like?
You know, it's interesting because I would say at the end of the day, the heaven of Marx's world is communism, is reaching the evolution. The last phase of man is the communism. And it looks almost like all other utopias in a way. It's like people are free to roam and write poetry, and there's equal distribution of goods. I always ask up front if I do a presentation, half the reason is to trick the audience. And I say, who's the father of communism? And everyone will say Karl Marx. And I'll say, no, he wasn't. The father of communism were Christian thinkers before him, communal thinkers, where they took it from the Acts of the Apostles in the Bible. The idea that we should share all our goods and come together as a community. So when you think about it in a way, it's almost like a hippie, like a nirvana for a hippie would be. So you write poetry. It's like a Woodstock, if you will, for an evolved man who doesn't have to worry about the economic pressures of life that drive especially an industrialized 19th century version of it, for sure.
Yes, there's this tidbit, something like, you could get up in the morning and work one job and then work another job in the afternoon and then be a literary critic in the evening, and it'll just be glorious.
I mean, it's a romantic vision. I mean, like, again, people don't think of Marx this way because we see mostly through the 20th century and the genocide and all the horror show that we witnessed in the wars. But he was at heart, I think, a romantic, an idealist, if you will. So he was thinking that way. And he himself was a Renaissance type guy. I mean, he played chess, he wrote poetry, he wrote plays, he did, all these deeper dives into archaeology and history. He was involved with at least 5 languages, 3 fluently. He was exiled 6 times, I think 5 or 6 times. So he lived in different countries. So he was someone like well-rounded. So I can understand why he would interpret nirvana that way.
Yeah. So the idea of Karl Marx as a romantic is kind of hard to find your way around that.
Capital R romantic, not little r. Okay.
Yeah. But what do you think is shaping him like that in his life? Because you've looked at his whole life.
Yeah, so he's born. I mean, context matters because he's born So another surprise discovery that just comes from research for me was that Marx was largely derivative of the time he was in, because his revolutionary ideas come largely from the French Revolution, which is Voltaire and Montesquieu. His economic ideas come from the Scottish Adam Smith, Ricardo. Um, his philosophical ideas all come from the Hegelian school, the left Hegelian school, which is Hegel and Bauer and Feuerbach. And so when I started looking at him, thinking he's largely derivative of his original ideas, what makes him unique is that he's in this swirl of the world moving away from the divine right of kings, more toward an enlightenment, post-enlightenment view of the world, where man is the center, human accomplishment is capable of anything, capitalism is the height of human evolution through economics. But he also is a deep reader of poetry, a Goethe follower, studying Faust. You think of the tradition of the Prometheus, Faust later becomes Frankenstein, like man reaching beyond his limits through the enlightened, being enlightened. But it's 19th century, so it's, if you know your music, you're moving from Mozart to Beethoven, right? So think of Beethoven, the Ninth Symphony or his symphonies. That's the world he's growing out of, the possible expression of the human being, where anything's possible, and ridding yourself of the older world of suspicions are coming. But as we know now, it came at a high price, for sure.
Could we go back to something you said there, comparing Faust to Frankenstein? What connection do you see there?
So if you study just through the line of history, like who fits the Promethean figure, it's I don't know if you know Prometheus is. He was the one punished by the Greek gods because he stole the fire, and he had the bird. Was it a bird or pecking at his liver for the rest of his life? But it's the idea of the gods punish men who are willing to be bold enough to challenge the whole system, to steal the secrets of the gods. So within that line, you have even Lucifer in the Christian tradition, but Prometheus is one. But the Faustian idea that he makes a pact also, the Faust story is what was one of Marx's favorites, because in a way, the enlightened man, again, is overcoming the superstition, or the superstitious part of it. But Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, it's Prometheus Unbound is literally the subtitle of the book. Frankenstein is Prometheus Unbound. So it's like he got untied again in Frankenstein, because it's, again, the releasing of what's possible in man's ingenuity and the Enlightenment. But that goes through all of history. There's a line, and Marx identifies with that line, and even identifies with the Luciferian language in that spirit of being the one willing to overturn the whole world. And that was Faust's line, Mephistopheles, right? He says, in order to start, I forgot the exact quote, but in order to start, you have to throw over the whole system and be bold enough. And even Dante says, like, forget everything you know and enter into the Inferno. So there is this challenge of man of like going beyond your means, but will you go too far that you'll wind up making a pact and being punished for your pride? Will your pride ultimately take you too far where you lose control?
Yes, we're opening a lot of different threads now.
No, you're doing it now,
which is great. It's great, and there's a lot to your writing in these ideas. Especially this Dante kind of thing in the world today, with our development of artificial intelligence and the ambition to create something that can think like a human being. What do you think about that as it relates to this progression from Prometheus?
That's a great question. So I'm a big fan, and one of the reasons I became a filmmaker was the movie Blade Runner, because Blade Runner would be yet another in the progress of the different mediums. I think Blade Runner is picking up on the same idea is, does a life have to be lived existentially to have meaning and purpose, or can it be implanted? Like the idea. So is a life that's lived in real time for 30 years the same as a life where you could put a 30-year memory into someone's mind? This is the ultimate question that AI presents, is knowledge in and of itself lived disembodied from existential life? Is it value? Does it have meaning and value? That's where AI is trouble. I do think AI will ultimately be like every other technology. If you think about the Gutenberg or the Roman roads or the digital highway, what's the saying again? The roads you build that go out into the world are the same roads your enemies come to destroy you on. And to me, I see all technology as having that double-edged sword to it. It could be both what kills you or could advance your cause, but it's knowing the restraints of where you put on restraints. And I don't think we have any restraints in the modern world on technology.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, can I add one more thing?
Please.
When I did a summary recently at an event in Princeton here, I said to everyone, if you asked me what was his prophecy, what was Marx's prophecy, and it would be something like this, very dumbed down in like 50,000 feet. It'd be something that when markets slow, they tend to concentrate wealth. If they can't find wealth and labor, they go outside the boundaries of the nation state, to look for cheap labor, where they could exploit cheap labor. And to do so, they also have to now own the mediums of technology. Then they buy the political class to have their policies put through. And then they buy the media so that they could create the myths or the justification for why they should be in power. It's the cycle of life. And I'm like, if you just think about the modern world, like five companies run the whole world. And one thinker, I can't pronounce his last name, but he's a Greek thinker, but he wrote a book called Techno-Feudalism. I recommend it. I used it for my book. But he thinks that in Marx's model, we went from master slave to serf lord to, proletariat, bourgeoisie or employer employee. But in his development, instead of going to communism, he thinks in the techno-feudalism, we've moved back one stage, back to feudalism, because the technology of being watched everywhere you go and someone being able to know your appetites and when you stop at a gas station, what your habits are, the food you like to eat, what you like to listen to, you don't realize that you might be so enslaved by what you think is freedom, but someone is watching you with the big eye all the time, determining you're almost on a reptilian level, like what you need next. And I thought he made a really good case, and I quote him in my book a lot.
Reptilian level. What do you mean by that?
Because without the reptile mind just reacts. It's like impulse. It's just evolutionary. It just reacts. So there's no like mammalian brain to slow it down or put it through another filter of thought or, like a pause to instinct. It just acts. So when they go into like logarithms and all the things that they program and you hear these guys who come out of Google who like quit their jobs because they're afraid of how much they're manipulating or they feel guilty. They get a conscience after 30 years or whatever. But you realize they all talk about that you could bypass right to the reptilian mind and create the appetites and then create the appetite and then lead people to keep feeding on the appetite of what you have. So in a way, what Marx is cautioning about the system and taking down the system and how power concentrates and controls, it's still going on. It's still happening. A lot of times it just takes on a different technological form. So we think it's different, but it's the same dynamics at work.
Mm-hmm. So with these progressions that you've seen through history, is being beaten by these progressions inevitable, or is there some way to resist?
So I say like the best of what I could think of for that profound question is I see a Christian worldview always, or the West, the idea of restraint being built in, that man is a sinner. He's never going to be complete. So he can't realize a perfect world in this world. And I think that kind of language, the symbol of the cross, they're humbling images. They're ways to remind you what man is capable of. And they caution and restrain. And I think that's the best of what we could do is have the messaging that says you can't make heaven on earth, that heaven is somewhere there's a transcendence to perfection, but it doesn't exist here. And I think that's our safest bet from always leading back to totalitarian thinking. Because I mean, let's face it, like profit doesn't have a conscience, money doesn't have a conscience, and power doesn't have a conscience. It feeds on itself. When, the stock market has to make money for its people to keep its books up, and I'm not like an anti-capitalist or anything. I'm just saying, but if you think about where is that moral conscience going to come from, I have the Christian worldview that's built largely on the Greco-Roman world, that like the Stoic and other word that we must restrain ourselves. So even technology has a caution built into it, You use a hammer, you don't worship the hammer.
Right.
It's a tool. It's not something you worship, but I think technology and others have written about how technology becomes the new idol.
Hmm. Yeah. So with the Blade Runner AI idea,
Uh,
there is certainly a developing idolization of AI. What do you think you take from Blade Runner as a story? I mean, you talked about how it asks the question of whether knowledge that's implanted is still relevant and important, but what do you get from it?
I think that scene at the end, at the penultimate scene where a baddie, I don't know if you remember the characters, but he's sitting on the rooftop and he's coming to his 4-year lifespan. It's at an end. I don't know
Yeah.
if you remember the famous scene and the rain's
Oh yeah.
coming down. Okay. And I think his line is, I've seen things you people who couldn't understand. I've had moonbeams off the coast of Orion. Like he, um, I've seen glitters of, I think he says all this poetic language at the end, but it was almost like he wanted another person to be witness to his value.
Yeah.
That at the end, like, what would his life be about? And I think back to my point about existential living versus program living, he was trying to say, I think the tragedy, and Ridley Scott, when he made that movie, lost his brother to cancer. So he's also facing death in his own life in a serious way. But what he was trying to say is we do not find value alone as beings.
Hmm.
We find it because others bear witness to our suffering. They bear witness to our tragedy, to our meaning, to our successes. So to live a life where it's all programmed internal, like information, but not born in the witness in the social settings of everyday life, existentially, they don't have meaning. Because in the end, I don't know if you remember, but the replicants, as they developed their emotion, kind of fell apart because they didn't know what to do. Like Frankenstein, right?
Mm.
The first thing Frankenstein wants was a mate.
Yeah.
He realized he was alone, right? He realized he was alone. So I think that's the part we forget. Technology is the lie a lot of times, that because something is knowledge and you can control it, it's enough, but we still are communal beings, like sociologically in need of each other, and that bearing of witness would be what I think is missing more and more. To be on your phone all day and just see people walking around on their phones all day makes the point, right? Right? I came up with a saying years ago: "As you can't see the stars if you're looking at your phone."
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for us to be so engrossed in our technology that something like Blade Runner is a reflection of how we're no longer bearing as much witness to the lives of others around us and being born witness to.
Well, the idea, if you remember, the replicants are made to serve certain roles, like pleasure model,
Yeah.
military model. One is he makes eyes, one makes toys. The idea is that when everything gets rounded down, not to qualitative things, but quantitative, like measurable things, like in a factory. Did like the Marx? I
Yep.
actually wrote an article once about Marx and Blade Runner. I haven't finished it. Started writing it. But when everything's reduced down to just you play this role, your humanity is sacrificed, which is kind of what Marx is saying here too. He's trying to say, like, just because you have a job and you fit in and it gives you something to do every day, it doesn't mean you're fulfilling a purpose or a meaning, which could be so much deeper or simpler than that. And I think in Blade Runner, that's what's happening is like, I'm more than the ballerina. I'm more than the pleasure model. I'm more than the killer or the hunter or the military guy. I'm a person. I'm a full human being. There's a imago Dei, if you will, inside of me, and it needs to be recognized. I think that's the message that comes through. And he does it by the analogy of replicants, but the replicants are us,
Mhm.
are human beings at the end, being caught in the Tyrell Corporation, which is like technology takes over the whole world. Do you remember?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then everyone who's really wealthy goes off colony. They don't live on the earth anymore because the conditions are too run down here because they don't take care of the environment. So these people are almost like the masses left behind while the very wealthy take off to the off-world colonies. And these 6 people are kind of like the lost children. It's a theme also in plays that goes through history too, of like the lost children looking for a God. They're looking for God. It was Tyrell in the story, if you remember.
Yeah.
He even says, I want more life, Father. Remember, he says to him in
Mm.
the Batty comes back to Tyrell and says, I want more life.
Right. Did you see the second one, 2049?
I did.
What did you think of that as it takes these themes, or was it a veering
Yeah.
off?
Yeah, veering off. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, just yeah. It's typical of sequels. Like The first one is such an authentic film made at an authentic time before they had CGI.
Mhm.
So he did that all. He was Ridley Scott was ahead of his time as an art director, and it's a visionary piece. It's like you're in a whole world he made, and it captures you, that whole world.
Oh, yeah.
The second one feels more fabricated. It's too expansive. It's, even the first one struggles for a plot because it's so thematically driven, but the second one was all over. I reviewed both of them, but I wouldn't compare them at all.
Yeah, the first one takes so much credit, I think, for what we see the idea of cyberpunk as, because it built that world. It had these looks and this sort of high tech but low life all running together all at once. And it's it's an icon for sure. Do you think Marx would have liked it?
I think Marx would have seen that movie reflecting his vision of the future.
Yeah.
I really do. I really do. Yeah, I think he would have. I think he would. As a matter of fact, if you think about Batty as basically Billy Idol, I mean, talking about cyber, I'm old enough to remember that. I was a kid, but I remember going to CBGB's in New York City at the time when like the Ramones are playing. But that is exactly what the cyberpunk was time. So he's capturing a time like in the 80s, but he's also capturing like this futuristic time. So it's a juxtaposition of like a dystopian cyberpunk world,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So for you, why Karl Marx?
So if I go back to my college days or independent reading in bookstores in New York, I read all of the Deconstructionists and the Masters of Suspicion, just to tear it all down to see what they had to say on Nietzsche and Freud and Marx. I did my reading of him then. I always thought like there was something to, there's a bit of the Wizard of Oz of the Masters of Suspicion where they like to pull back the curtain and show how human beings are capable of fooling themselves and then projecting a reality that serves themselves, like in life at the expense of others. Like that's the suspicion. You have to be suspicious of things to sometimes be critical of them. So there's a strain in all of them that make a contribution. I think Nietzsche is much more influential than Marx, actually, and Nietzsche influences Marx. But all of them are pulling back. Like, could people have a faith where they see it as resentment? Like in the end, God will punish you, and then somebody gets psychological retribution in the world. Yeah, I mean that's possible. Could people use religion as an opiate, meaning like the wealthy have all the wealth, and then they just tell others, "Well, you pray about it." You keep praying about. I remember when I was, what was his name? I don't know if you remember the presidential candidate Gary Bauer. Remember Gary Bauer? He ran probably in the anyway. But when he ran for president, I met with him while I was making a film, and I did a screening in Washington when he was working with, I think it was the Trump administration. It was part of like a religious coalition. But I went to him. We were sharing things, and I said, I'm fundraising. Anybody you think I could talk to, whatever. And he told me his story. He said, like, he was going around he was like a minor candidate, but he was going against the Bushes or something. I forget what the competitor was. So he really didn't have a chance, but he was standing more for the moral majority, or he had like he was a cause candidate, but he was always asking for money. And he said, so many people said, well, if God wants you to, to do this, God will get you the money. And he said, he finally had to come up with an answer for everyone.
Yeah.
He goes, no, I asked God and God said, you're going to give it to me. So I started using that example. So my point to you is, even Marx, when he's saying, it's the opiate of the masses, it could be used that way.
Mm-hmm.
It could be a way to say to you, well, just God will take care of you, or your suffering was meant to be this way because God's trying to show you something. So there is that passing of responsibility over that I think Christians do, especially in the evangelical strain of modern Christianity. But I think Marx is like a correction of that in saying, no, but there's a real world going on now where people really they don't need an idea of a home. They actually need a home. People need a job. Like if you go back to the 2000, like 2020 with COVID and all that, and now I'm going to Minneapolis to bring you up to date. So now I'm up looking at Minneapolis, and I lived through 9/11 in New York. I was a victim in the 2008 real estate market crash. Like I had a new home that was like on the rise at a time where there was no risk of even investing at the time. Everything was like all boats are floating, and I was the victim of that. And then up to COVID, where I lost my business for a while, it closed down, and So the world was becoming something totally different. And then you see all these riots and protests in the streets and all these fires burning down these cities. And I remember saying to myself, this doesn't just happen. This is like the case of dry leaves and someone throws a match into it, because putting the genuine racist tensions aside, which you have to consider, but not for this conversation, what's really going on there is you have like a whole generation of kids who they're not married, they don't have homes, they can't afford jobs, and the economy has run away from them pretty much. This is the Marxist. And I think when I'm looking at that, I'm seeing as a conflagration of like all these forces that have come in. I'm saying, who's behind all this? You have like generations of Marxist teaching behind this, like putting together and predicting all these things coming, these forces. So when they all come together on the streets, I remember that night when they burned the police station down. I think it was May 29th, 2020. And I went to bed that night and I was listening to the Divine Comedy, an audiobook series. And Paul Kenger, who sent me his book to review on Marx. So I'm reading Marx, I'm listening to Divine Comedy on audiobook, and the cities are burning down in the United States. And I had a dream. And in the dream, I go on this journey and I'm traveling through these tunnels, and the tunnels are like crossing through state lines. And I'm on my way from Princeton to Minneapolis to find in the flames Karl Marx. He's in there somewhere. And that became kind of like a snapshot of my journey to go figure out once and for all, like, how are his ideas still coming to life, still catching fire, if you will, all these years? So one of the first conclusions I came to was that his ideas are not, if an idea can be transposed over time, if it could possess different generations over time, it must have somewhat of a ghostly figure, like a ghost could possess different people, right, at different times. So it's not like one idea that's dead by the 18th century and then doesn't live on. And that's when I started asking the question, what's the quality of his ideas, the resentment, the inequality, the power relationships, all these ideas that he put in play, they seem like they translate over time because they're speaking to injustice or inequality, or maybe to an extreme. And I'm not saying all his teachings are right or wrong, but the critique, and so I realized there was a lot of writings about him called the specter of Marx, which is another word, an English word for ghost, the ghost of Marx. So I started thinking of him more like not so much ideas wise, but a collection of insights or moods, in the same way like the Divine Comedy is made up of a series of virtues that you climb through. It's almost like the negative version, the inversion of that is Marx, with like resentment and envy. And so it's like a series of people who are on the outside, who are embittered by a society, who are outsiders and not being valued. There's a collection of their own expressions and moods, and all of that's coming in those flames on the streets. And I wanted to do an investigation of like his life, where did his ideas come from, and is what I'm seeing today reflective of his own life? And that's why I did my book in the form I did, which is a biography, but like a thematic with a high concept. Right?
Mm-hmm. And
a lot said there. I hope I was clear. That was a lot to say.
But we got a lot to work with.
Okay.
So what you see in Minneapolis, things going on during all the lockdowns and such, is that Marxism at play?
I think what I'm saying is what happened to our capitalism at the time is reflective of Marx's prediction of the critique of capitalism at its extremes. Okay. That there was no wages did not grow at the same level as real estate. So you had a whole generation where people couldn't buy homes. Mm-hmm. So you have people, if you have young people going into their late 20s and 30s and they're not married, they don't have a job that could support a lifestyle, and they can't afford a home, you've removed from people probably the two or three most important acts of being responsible and maturity and ownership that was in our culture for the prior, history of the culture. Now you've got this vacuum you created. Like, where's the purpose? You don't have a house to live in. You don't have the job. You're not married. You don't have responsibility of children. So I'm saying what happens is now you're searching for purpose, and part of searching for purpose is to find meaning and virtue. And if you're in a vacuum like that and you see an imbalance of power, so you have a whole bunch of people who keep getting wealthier and wealthier and wealthier and having a lot more control, then I'm saying his ideas would kick in because it'd be pointing a mirror to the very thing you're experiencing in your own life. And I think that was what was coming through.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what we were seeing looks a lot like the projections that Marx sees for how a capitalist system could go in
Yes.
a bad direction.
Almost like Blade Runner in a way. We're watching the Blade Runner.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So you see this, and then what happens next?
So I saw that, and then I said, okay, how do I want to do this? I love to write biography. To me, biography is philosophy. I think they're
Huh.
inseparable. I think one's like you never are disembodied in your thoughts, even when you write. There's a saying of filmmaker, like there's only one plot to all films, and that's getting the money to make the film. But there's also, I thought, there's only one plot to all biographies or books I've written, and it's usually like what's present in my life at the time that's really important to me because there's so many things to touch upon in a person's life. So I started, number one was I didn't want to do a full biography, that's a life's work. That's like 50 years you could do that just to get every chronological date right. And I did a lot of homework here. I originally had 2,500 endnotes, but I narrowed them down to 1,000 or so. So it was a lot of work, and I probably could have written 3 volumes if I had the time. But my first concept was he loved Dante a lot, quoted him. Some said he memorized Dante's Divine Comedy. I don't know if anyone could memorize it, but he was pretty smart. So if anyone could, he could do that. But he loved him. He quotes him something like 13 times. He and Engels quote Dante a lot. And I thought and he speaks a lot. What makes Marx interesting is he uses literary terms in economic places or political places. He talks about capitalism as the vampire. So he's got Gothic language, a very powerful, his language pops. Like good propagandists are like this. Mm-hmm. They write really well. But so he had this energy about him where he was also collecting literary references. Faust is another one. Hamlet, he knew Hamlet well. So I started playing around with what if we use his literary references, not the typical political ones, to kind of to use it against his own life. So if we looked at his biography and how he lived, and we used his poetic or plays or whatever, his literary references for tools for analysis of his life and how he thought about things as a mirror, what would that look like? So the Divine Comedy, which becomes a Divine Tragedy in my case, I inverted it, becomes what if Dante knew of Marx? Where would he put Marx in his Divine Comedy? Would he put him in Inferno, Purgatory, or Paradiso, right? So the first thing was like, let's go on this journey together. So it was me going with Dante and some of these other writers like Goethe and Hamlet and Shakespeare and others, going on a journey like in Dante's journey to investigate the life of this man Marx and put him on trial at the end, like in the end, see where he lands in the Divine Comedy using these other literary devices, but telling his real story. Like, where did he learn? Why did he think the way he did? Where did his ideas come from? And that was kind of like how I thought I could do it in a new, fresh, poetic way, where number one, I would eliminate the stereotype or the left-right talk about Marx, where he either gets dismissed or satanized or whatever, or he's only seen through the totalitarian systems that come later, like Stalin and Mao, and which he does have the antecedents for that, but provides them, but it's not the whole story. And like how to see him in a new, fresh way, because to me, I say, if you don't have your own worldview, you're thinking Karl Marx's thoughts right now, because he's the most influential thinker in our lives right now. And how can we unpack and see where it came from, but in a real life way, an existential journey with him. So he's young, he's writing this book. What's he doing at the time? How is he relating to his wife and his children? Who are his influences? And I go on this, and the Greek choir, the Greek chorus for me are these literary figures who come in and out to comment on him, mainly Dante.
Mm-hmm. Robert, you said he's the most influential figure in our lives today.
Yes.
I want to come back to that. But first, you said something that stood out to me. You said the plot to every movie is to get the money to make the movie.
Yeah.
So I'm aware of the idea of some movies being meta-cinematic. You know, they're sort of movies about making movies.
Yes.
But what are you saying with that?
That the most difficult thing to do as a filmmaker is to find funding.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like the plot, most people think of filmmakers as like sitting around being creatives all day, but 90% of your job is raising money and keeping people on board.
And then whatever happens.
Believe in what you wind up, you wind up being a creative. 10% of the effort is usually 10% is when you actually are being creative, except for like exceptions where you have a big studio or you're really set for something. But even then, most of your work is managerial or,
Mhm.
but people just think about it. Creatives just sitting around going, what a great idea. Let's try that. But really you're doing that 10 or 20% of the time.
Yeah, it is romantic though. I mean, films, like it's this medium, it's got so many dimensions to it. It's visual, there's sound, there's usually music, there's so much to it that it seems like what a gorgeous piece of art.
Yeah, no. So I always say to people, if you want to de-glamorize it's like parents will come to me even locally and they'll say, can you, my son or daughter wants to be in film and could you do this? And I said, the first question is, are they good at anything else? And if they say, yeah, they're pretty, I said, well, if they could do anything else, do something else because it's not a choice you make. It's got to be something you're compelled to do because of the drive you would need. But the other thing is, if you want to de-glamorize film for people, just bring them on a set.
Mm.
It's just, it's tedium. It's like you realize something on paper and then it's just broken down into a whole set of tedium, days and days of just move the cup here and make sure the light's here and try that again. And it's people sweaty and annoyed. But it's like keeping it all together, but keeping the vision at the end, you collect all these pieces, which are like intelligent guesses too, by the way. They're not like, it's like someone gives you a clock and starts the clock here and says, someone's got to make 2,000 choices and you've done it more than we have. You're going to make the 2,000 choices. Then shut the clock off here, shut the money off. Then you're going to go into a back room and you're going to put it all together like a puzzle. And hopefully it matches the script that you did. But it's all tedium. It's all breaking it down to very mechanistic approaches and different departments and schedules and everything.
Yeah, that tedium that you mentioned is interesting. I was an officer in the United States Navy. And
Okay.
then I remember going to LA one time and being on set and just seeing so many parallels between a military operation and a day on set trying to get things done. And you got the boss here calling the shots. And then you got these people who have these specialized tasks and you're trying to put them all together. And the parallels were amazing to me.
I use the model of military models for my life, to organize my life, but I have written articles about why filmmaking is just like military, down to using the analogies of how you structure it. I mean, the director is the general,
Yep.
right? Then the departments are like the lieutenants, but it's like, how do you, when do you use blitzkrieg, and when do you use, if you have X amount of like a small budget, do you have to go blitzkrieg? You make it like a spear point approach as opposed to a broad, a broad line of. There's all these different things, and the analogies just keep working over and over.
Yeah.
I've written a book on General Patton. I don't know if you know this,
Yes.
but and then I wrote a second book, which I'm hoping to publish, on why Patton thought so well. And in that book, I open up by talking about how film can be modeled exactly on how he thought about efficient efficiency on the battlefield.
Oh, interesting. What stands out there?
Well, it's like the lack of waste. It's the lack of waste. It's the concentration of. It goes back to Clausewitz, with the idea of like you penetrate. It goes back. If you go back to the cavalry, which is what Patton was, a cavalryman, so he knew horses are what become tanks later. You know that probably. The horses are what become tanks, and the tanks are really, they advance because of the trenches in World War I, because they had to go over the trenches, so the tracks become much more. But like MacArthur and Patton, and those were still men who fought in the cavalry who knew the earlier way of doing it. But the whole idea was you penetrate in a blitzkrieg, which is what Rommel did to get through France.
Mm-hmm.
So you break through the line once, and then you force the enemy to circle on itself and start basically shooting at itself. And then it's more about capturing and not spending so much ammo like on a front line where you spread out too thin and everything. So the idea is quick penetration on a spear point, puncture the enemy, then have them turn in on themselves and then surround them and capture them. So you don't waste the money. You do it quickly. You do it with air cover, communications, supplies.
Yes.
Like Patton is really sharp at this, and he's got the whole thing down. And if I study his battles in it. I use not the whole thing, but he does that when he turns north to go for the Battle of the Bulge in the snowstorm. Like how he had the socks, the rations down. He was a logistics freak, but it's the lack of waste of time and bureaucracy, and it's about how do you destroy the enemy and quickly and economically and get it done without losing a lot of men.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that point about logistics, there's this saying, something like amateurs talk strategy and pros talk logistics.
Right,
you got to get it done in the end. Anything
Yeah.
else on this movie metaphor before we go back to Marx being the biggest thinker of our time?
On the military. No. Yeah, I'm just trying to think of the title. It's out there somewhere if you look up my name, but it was for documentary filmmakers. Why it's maybe I could follow up. I don't know if there's a way to
Sure. Yeah.
post it
that's what we
somewhere
could-
after. But it was
put it in the
about
show notes.
Blitzkrieg, like be Blitzkrieg. Strike fast if you're going to do a documentary. Strike fast, strike hard, know what you want, penetrate. It's all about that patent like quick advancement. Get it done.
Yeah. I would bet with documentary too, because then you're going real places and things. You gotta line people up and get things set. So very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So Robert, Marx, the biggest thinker of our time. What brings you to that conclusion?
Because the biggest thinker are our presuppositions or our assumptions about the way the world works. So if you thought of things like the haves and the have-nots, that the world is divided up into different powers, this binary way we see the world today in race, the way we see it, like how we've made enemies of men and women, and how we've done like all these assumptions are not necessarily the way you need to see the world. There's many different ways. You could, like I was saying before, you could see inequality not only because someone is controlling the power structure of another. It could be because natural gifts, the natural order. It could be environment. Someone has more discipline than another person. Someone's crippled, someone has injuries. People get sick. People don't have purpose. There's a whole way of looking at life, but he's reduced it down to a way, and it's definitely in academia and in most of the media, where we're always seeing it as that them or us way. Politics is like this. So there's always a bad and good. It's a way to structure the world, to break it into binary causes. So there's the haves and have-nots. Then there's the envy again, the resentment that you need to protest to bring down, which is true. It's like a layer, but I think there's a much more sophisticated tapestry of the way the world works. But we live under these assumptions almost all the time. And it's everywhere. I think academics, politics, the way people talk, the way people think of gender and everything now, I think it's ubiquitous.
So this is the Marxist idea of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, but being put onto otother domains that you see everywhere.
So for him, it was class. It was just money, economics. But if you go, and I don't know how far you go into the Bible, but if you think about Paul writes in Galatians, like in Christ, there's no man or female, master, slave, Greek or Jew. Like he's trying to say that these binaries that we find in life are in Christ. The way he's saying it is, they're not things you obliterate. They're things you learn to appreciate because they're different than you. But in love, you compensate for the two. There's empathy, compassion. You make amends for that, and that's how you have community. For Marx, he's saying, and this is in the Communist Manifesto, that these structures themselves you should be suspicious of because they're facades for the powerful to protect their power where they are. So for a man and women to operate where a woman is in a domestic position is a man. I think Engels says a woman's role in the house is like a prostitute or whatever, or what any worker is always under an oppressive regime, whatever. So your suspicion like runs amok and you're always seeing these things. But he saw it through class. But this is my point before about the specter. But you could take the structure of that and impose it on race too. So anytime you see a black person here, a white person here, if the white person is in a position of authority, then it's always because there's been racism and there's no other way to look through that lens. That's why I mean he's dominated that binary way of looking at the world. And there's a philosopher who I quote a lot in the book, Alistair McIntyre. He just died, and I dedicated the book along with my mom on him, but he brings up the example, I think this is the best example I can come up with, of the fishing, the crew that goes out in the morning for the village. Let's use the analogy of like a small village, and there's a team that gets on a boat, And there's a captain, and there's people who cut the bait and people who throw out the nets. And so there's like a team, and they all have different functions. And in the morning, they go out and they got to capture the fish and bring in the catch for the day and feed the village, what they're doing. So where Marx falls wrong, it would be like if someone was like new at the job, they got their job and they're working for a week, they don't get on the boat and question why there's a captain. They don't question like, is he in power because he oppressed everybody? It's just that you understand the purpose is to find competent people to get this job done. And the purpose is to bring the fish back and feed the people. So the idea of a hierarchy by definition being evil or suspicious is a misguided way of looking at the world. Because what would you say? We need to obliterate all captains of ships? Like we need to overturn all captains of ships? So the natural order is what Marx throws overboard and says there is no hierarchy. Everything is a social construct made through the interest of power and self-interest. Now, that's the dominant thought of our culture. There's no doubt in my mind.
So
I mean, it's partly true, but I'm saying it's the dominant, idea.
So that binary in Marx's time was about economic status.
Yes.
If we were to distill it down to this thing that now goes through our culture, what is that binary that is spreading?
Well, the class is the money piece of it. That's more like the material piece of it. But I think it's more seeing that there's no natural order. So there's no nothing stays the same. Everything is a social construct. So if you look at it that way, it means there's no such thing as a man or a woman. It's like what you think you are, or the way the society determines you are that. So there's no such thing as like competency or hierarchy, a natural hierarchy. Like some people are just going to be better at things. So there'll be a natural hierarchy, just like in the military, right? Like some people are going to shoot better than others. But I think once you take away that there's a natural order, which is the Christian or classic worldview that now has been undermined by Marxist thinking, it means that everything is seen suspiciously, because anytime you see a hierarchy, you get to question who's the power behind it, manipulating the hierarchy to be that. And then you could put that in any one of these race, gender, politics, or whatever. You could then impose it on these other things. But I think it's not the money issue, is more the material piece of it, but it's more the suspicion that there's no natural order in the world. There's nothing to be observed that's permanent. It's all being a social construct made up.
So that's any sort of authority, any sort of power,
any kind of hierarchy. A hierarchy, there's no other reason for hierarchy other than someone oppressing others.
Okay, so someone, and hierarchy being the power to make a decision that influences others.
Yeah, like I think hierarchy is largely built on competency, right? Like a bunch of people get in a room and figure out like how do we survive? And like, I'm better at this, you're better at this. They figure it out and they form hierarchies are formed. Corporations form them, but hierarchies a lot have to do with competency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. And there are hierarchies where people who are less competent do figure out how to rise.
Well, that's why I'm saying I am not going to argue with Marx about abuse of these things. That's why I think his critique is right on.
Yeah. How does understanding this help you see things in life?
Say it again. Sorry.
How does understanding this help you to see things going on in your life?
I don't know if that's a healthy thing. I think it's almost like the things that attract me, one, are enigmatic characters, because I think maybe I'm one too, to some degree. So enigmatic characters usually have contradictory parts to them. And because there's parts that contradict themselves, there's a dialectic built into them, but it leads to like almost like an internal argument where new things are coming. They're very interesting and creative and innovative and things like that. The second thing is usually it's a question I feel like no one is either addressing or answering properly. So in this Marx case, I felt like the right largely ignores Marx, or they talk through the lens of 20th century genocide. And the left either sees him as a bit of they write hagiographies about him or use his critique, but never get into the dangers and the suspicion or the antecedents of his thinking that I think are dangerous and true. And I don't think they parse him fairly, or at least what I've seen. So I thought like we have this influential figure who's dominating like so much of our culture, but no one's addressing him completely. They're either using him as a piñata, or they're nuancing him in academia, but not really calling a spade, or being truthful about his real danger and influence and calling him out, if you will. So when I saw that, I thought like, wow, so we're not even talking for real about the character who's influencing most of our thinking and our culture. And that's why I wanted to dig in and say, I started for a year, and normally I would say 9 months to a year and a half digging into something. I kind of see a pattern after a while, and you get to know the right books. But this was 5 years of work, and it's never stopped. And I saw how many things he influenced. And so I think one is developing a way to critique something. How is it beneficial? Like how to speak honestly about something, how to speak humanely about something, how to start a conversation or a dialogue that's not out in the world now. I don't believe people are talking about Marx the way I am right now. And I think there's a deep need to do so because a lot of people are aware of his influence, but they don't know how to talk about it in an informed way unless they're either in academia or just bashing him from the outside.
Yeah, you said that you don't hear people talking about him the way you do, and I would agree that there's this, connect him with the devil, connect him with all the death from communism and things like that, or there's a praise. What do you think the middle ground that you're holding really is?
So I think there is, people do evolve over time. There are phases of Marx, just like anything. And if he lived from 1818 to 1883, 65 years, like he does evolve too to some degree.
Sure.
So I would just say that there's no such thing as a pure, but I'll use the word. A pure Marxist critique of capitalism, I think, is largely true. And I could just tell you in Catholic social teaching, I don't know what your background is, Catholic social teaching agrees with this. They believe that his critique of that society cannot exist purely for the making of money, like the libertarian dream, but has to ultimately consider the moral fabric of a culture in what it does, things like this. So his critique in that sense of like pulling back the curtain again, and he's not alone. It's so funny. In the book, a lot of times I'll quote Adam Smith, but I'll do it in a way where you think it's Karl Marx, but it's Adam Smith critiquing how dangerous capitalism is without moral sentiment. I don't know if you know the moral sentiment. He wrote Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations as a 2-part series, Adam Smith, and he didn't think one exists without the other. So he knew of the dangers of it. So there's a pure critique of Marx. Then I think there is where it goes off the rails to begin with is the idea that it all has to be revolution for change, that things have to be so radical at all times, because it's almost like sometimes the devil you know could be better than the devil you don't know. So he seemed slower for reform, never to use reform or restraint. It was all about burn it all down, like burn the whole system down. You need the conflict to start the new thing over. I think that's another phase of him that I think starts to go off the rails, because sometimes you do need revolution. Like history, you do need revolution, and it happens. And he was witness to what the French Revolution did too. So he saw revolution. But then after that, I think his sin, what he didn't understand was anthropology, like the makeup of man. So he didn't understand, again, that man is not, going back to the Faust idea, he's not a replicant. He's capable of sin. He's not benign when he has power. So he will not become a despot and help all these people and then give over power back to this communist nation. So he was kind of ignorant of how anthropology worked, or very off about how he thought about it. And I think where it breaks down is that's the danger. So now, because if you don't know the element of mankind, the struggle, you just think it's economic. You just think of everyone has more money, or they're all going to be nice people. You're missing the whole point. So that's where he left the door open for, now you have totalitarian despots come in and say, oh, I'm going to use Marxist critique of bringing imperialism or capitalism down to its knees through a revolution. And then this other age will come, and instead we see what comes. Genocide, and Mao and Stalin don't give over their power. They never do.
Of course. Yeah.
So it's the lie that the problem is not the state. It's not capitalism. It's man. The problem is men are sinful. Men are not these enlightened beings just, ready to break out and become poets once they all have equal amounts of money.
Sure.
So there's the idealism run amok and the dangers of idealism and why it's attractive to young people, because it's a very idealistic way to look at the world, right? Anything's possible.
Yeah. And Robert, you mentioned Catholic social teaching.
Yeah.
One concept that stands out to me and that it seems related here is an idea of subsidiarity, handling things at the lowest level and then taking them up as you need to. And
Right.
it seems that a sort of communist approach makes sense at a very low level, a family or a community of people who volunteer to sort of enter into that together. But that as you get higher and higher, it becomes an imposition rather than sort of a collective goal. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I use the word parochial. Like, I think when I use the term case for restraint, that's what I mean. I think the smaller, the better. It's just more manageable. People know each other. It's, the person will live on the block that they need to be concerned with, not like caring for something that's on the other side of the world where they're indifferent to the suffering of the people around it. So being involved in that community, and I think that's what the Constitution, the American experiment was. It was about taking things down to the local levels, let the people make their decisions, looking face to face. Even the Romans did this year where, I don't know if you know this, but like senators would have to go out and meet with X amount of people on the street to stay in touch with the needs of the people. But I agree with you. I think subsidiary and smaller, because anything when it gets concentrated, that's the danger. When power concentrates, whether it's the state or money, that's when it's dangerous. And Marx was no fan. This is another misnomer. Marx was no fan of the state. He thought you needed the state temporarily to take over the means of production to give it back to the people. But he didn't think he thought the state was just an arm of capitalism, which it is. I mean, so.
Yeah. You talked about revolution. You even made the revolution signal with your fingers, sort of like a revolving or rotating disc. What do you think he would have said would end the revolution? When would Marx have been content?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. When does it, and that's one of the critiques, like when do you stop burning things down? And who promises that the people coming up in the revolutionary hierarchy are going to be any better than the people you're kicking out, right? Like, what makes the proletariat so much more higher minded than the bourgeoisie once they have power? I mean, from what I've read, there is that kingdom of God moment. There's that nirvana where there's enough equal distribution and things are done at a level like that. I don't know where the cutoff point would be. I don't know. Is it perpetual revolution, or at some point does it settle into a new kingdom where you've reached enough of a level of balance where it's, yeah, I don't know. I don't know I don't know if there's a defined transition there. And that's a great question.
Yeah.
Because when do you stop revolting? Like, when do you go, okay, we've arrived. We don't need to burn anything else down right now. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know either, and I've read some of the works of Marxism, not just him, but subsequent thinkers, and it seems that there are two ideas. It seems that there is this idea that we kind of get there and everybody's taken care of, and also this idea that we need to keep pushing and never stop pushing, and it will be a continuous struggle, and the two don't quite seem to match up.
Yeah, I would say then, with the way you just posed that, I would say the latter to me seems like what my witness of the real world has been. It seems almost sometimes the novelty of change or the new becomes almost like the drug. Like, you have to come up with something to always be in this perpetual change to feel like you're doing the right thing, especially in the protesting it's always finding either another group or an outside or someone who has to be the next change. Otherwise, it's like the shark has to keep moving. Otherwise it dies. And sometimes it seems like it's almost like mindless revolution. You're revolting to revolt because that's what you do. It's almost like a virtue signaling that's empty at times. So I would say the latter part of what you said is kind of why it doesn't work, because there's probably points where you'd have to slow down or think in terms of reform or slower change, or you're not ready to revolt yet, but I don't think it modulates like that.
Mm-hmm. It seems like the thrill of being an activist or a revolutionary is an insatiable sort of craving, or maybe you mature out of it, but for those who are in that phase, that it would be very hard to know when to stop.
Yeah, I would use, other than the word prophetic in his thinking, I would say he was, Marx is a pure activist. It's almost change in and of itself is the goal, regardless of the damage it causes or the ramifications or the consequences. It's the change. He said philosophy is not to think correctly, it's to change the world. Like he knew it wasn't about finding the truth, it was about changing the world. So by definition, if you're not changing something and something's not changed, which by the way, if you break that down, so if you think about conservative versus progressive, right? So if you think about the extremes of both, so a conservative, like by definition, if we're giving them the credit of the essence of what that tendency is, that strain, conservative saying, you've looked through history, you've studied history, there's a natural order, there are things worth conserving. So you have a core set of values that are worth conserving, right? At times you have to progress because the conserving of that may kill you. It's not, if you're, I'll use a podcast example. At some point, if you don't use some of your money to spend on advertising to get your name out or whatever, if you don't progress by using money actively, you may not be known and your podcast might die out for a lack of audience or something. So you can't always be conserving, but to progress is to acknowledge that the world does change. There is change. It could be measured. It could be more or less. But the extremes of both for the conservative is to think that everything stays the same, right? And the sin, if you will, or the extreme of the progressive is things are always having to change, that nothing stays the same. So you think of him as like an activist, progressive. By definition, everything has to keep moving at all times, and that's where we're getting into the trouble again. And I go back to the Christian worldview is not one or the other. It sees both. It sees the contingency of life held together by a core set of values, and the two are acknowledged. So there's the real world that's changing, but there's core values that you'll always take with you. And that's not the integrative model of our politics. Our politics tends to run to the extremes because there's more of a, being extreme gives more of a reward to people, right? No change is more attractive than change sometimes, or most of the time. It's not as attractive as never change. This is what it's always been this way, and progressives, we need to keep doing this. We need to keep doing this. But I got the idea from Marx that he was always, unsettled. And I'll give you one interesting story. So I found out, I'm a bit of a chess player, but I found one game he played. And do you play chess at all?
A little bit.
Okay. So chess, you can't lie in chess. Like, you're exposed. You play a game with people who know how chess is played and your personality is revealed. And you don't need many games to know that. You could just know instincts, the way someone opens, when they use certain moves or whatever. So I watched it. I studied this one game. I think it was with a German guy named Meyer he played. And he played this game and he played King's Gambit. It's an unusual game to play, and it usually could cause it. You have to sacrifice two pieces to win position early in a game, which is very radical to do in a chess setup. So I played this whole game out, and I went and I studied it to the point where I almost memorized the whole game. And I look at it and I go, this game is Karl Marx. So if someone said to me, who is Karl Marx's personality character? So anyway, I live in Princeton, New Jersey, and I think he's the top ranked Grand Master in the history of New Jersey, if I'm not mistaken. He's pretty high up there. And he used to teach my son to play. So I called him up and we went to dinner. I hadn't seen him in years. And I took the name off the game. Yeah. And we just having dinner and drinks, and I gave him the game. And I said, just do me a favor. Just look at this game. Now you have to realize how fast this guy is going to see the game.
Sure.
In 2 seconds, he's going to see the whole thing. And I said, he goes, who is I? I'm not going to tell you, and I don't want to lead you. I said, just tell me, look it over. It won't take you long. It was like 30 moves or whatever. And he looks at the game and he goes, here is a very radical guy that'll do anything to win and doesn't care about the risk. Oof. And it was something close to that. And I was like, I could not believe what I was seeing, because that's Karl Marx. Mm-hmm. So it's like, you do whatever it takes. And it was ingenious what he was doing in the game, because he actually was giving up pieces, but kept his opponent to the point where he kept him on his heels the whole time. But he took so many risks to do it. It was almost like he didn't care what the outcome would be. Yeah. He was going to play all the way down. And that's Karl Marx.
Did he win the game?
He did.
Huh.
Yeah. And he came back from those early losses, the King Gambit's loss, where he had to sacrifice 2 pieces early.
Yeah. Do you think in his greater game he was a winner?
Hmm. Interesting. Good question. It's rare that I have to take a moment
Take
to
your
think.
time.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I don't think he would have recognized the Bolshevik Revolution. I think if you think about the way he imagined communism and its birth, it was more coming from an urban center, like intellectual thinking, coffee shops, French Revolution. It winds up being farmers in Russia, like a backward nation. I don't think he would have seen that, and I don't think he would have seen Stalin or any of these totalitarian systems as reflective of what he was talking about. So, but would he have seen in the critique? I think it's a mixed bag. I think he would have seen the totalitarian strains as going way off of anything he was hoping for, or a disaster, because if he thought that would lead to nirvana and that it led to genocide, I mean, that'd be a horror show. But on the other hand, look at all the wars we've been in. I mean, look at all how capitalism is financed largely by military budgets. I mean, like, I don't want to sound like I'm too much of a critique without being careful in each case, but you just look at the way, I don't know what your stance is on Ukraine and the Middle East and all the wars we've been in, just on and on and on, and money and like they have no reason behind it, but money gets financed and military budgets. And so there's like a machinery to life that I think he'd feel like this is exactly what I'm talking about. Why capitalism alone cannot govern the world, because profit knows no limit. It must survive and keep eating like the animal kingdom, and it does. So I think it'd be a mixed bag, I would say.
It sounds like he would be disappointed at the way that his ideas have been used, and also at all the places where they're not having the influence he would have hoped for.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah,
Maybe.
fair way of putting it. Yeah,
maybe.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, he has so much influence still, long after he's dead. Like you said, maybe the most important thinker of our time.
Is the critique. It's the critique again. He's pulling back because he is, I mean, if you just look at this, even in religious terms, you could argue the Apostle Paul is a radical.
Sure.
Like he's a former murderer of Christians and comes in and then tells all the senior apostles that he's the new guy. He had a vision and God called him to go save the Gentile. Like you could look at him as shattering prior understandings of everything. And going back to my interest in enigmatic characters like Patton and these people, it's usually these radicals who take these big leaps and take these giant risks who do find the fire. They do, or at least they step to the other side and go, they peek behind the curtain, like Plato's cave. They come outside and go, oh, we're all looking at shadows over here. So someone has to be like that to even potentially stumble on something new. He's definitely in that camp. So his critique of saying, and by the way, he was a big fan of capitalism. He was a big fan of it. He just thought its time had come to now evolve to something else. But he didn't think there was another system that did more for human ingenuity and progress than capitalism. He just believed its time had come to move on to this next stage. And I think the Industrial Revolution and his version he was seeing of the new capitalism being born was so abusive, especially in London in 1841. I think he moved there 1841. So he's living in London. That's like Charles Dickens' time. So think about Hard Times and think about the Christmas Carol. Like you're looking at people like living in those conditions. And Engels wrote about this and whatever. So you're seeing like the soot, the bricks all like soot. They talk about women living in these hovels and having children on the stoop. Just the worst of the conditions they're probably getting early. And Dickens is a socialist too. I mean, so, it's not uncommon for people to have this concern what's going on. But he thought capitalism was the best up until that point. And he's making a really good point, because if you go back, let's assume his stages are correct, that there is something like master, slave, lord, serf, and then proletariat and bourgeoisie. Let's just assume those, or let's say employer, employee, to make it more modern. If you assume that and you went back to the master slave, right? era. We don't know exactly where that begins and ends, but somewhere toward the late Roman Empire and going toward the medieval times. At a certain point at the edge of that, at the cusp of that, before it goes into its lord serf phase, if someone said to you, this system has been pretty good for us, but we really need to overturn the system, what are you going to say? What are you, a communist? My point to you is like, you would never think that system would change to something else.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't have been wrong. Look, in retrospect, it's not wrong that someone thought there's a better system than that. So you can't knock Marx for aspiring to that. I don't know what that looks like. I think some of these co-op ideas that you're starting to see with businesses, I don't know if you looked into this.
Yeah.
Like co-op and ownership. There's probably conversations that are, this is where it's above my pay grade. But I think he's not wrong in questioning, well, if you had this dialectic here and it changed, and you have this dialectic here and you have this dialectic, and it still leads to a lot of inequality. And yes, it's better than the one before it, but so to keep looking for that new thing is not necessarily bad. So you can't critique him and call him the what do you want? Communism? Maybe it's not communism is the answer, but maybe there is a progression from where we are to a better version of what capitalism is today.
Mm-hmm. It seems that there's a conflict in his view of human nature. That on the one hand, he's very aware of how things like power corrupt and how that's very attractive and natural, and yet a lot of hope that people could execute on this utopic vision. What do you think his view on human nature really is?
You ask really good questions, I must say. I'm not just patting the host. I'm just asking good questions because I think that's one of the crazy things about him is people think of him as a crazy atheist. And being a theological thinker, I went another level down, and it almost made me crazy to do this. I went back to his dissertation with Democritus and Epicurus. And I went into all his thinking with Spinoza and whatever, and he's trying to be consistently materialist. So he takes, without getting too philosophical, he takes a Hegelian model of a dialectic of world spirit, which means like every culture learns from the next, and it all moves toward this world spirit, which is really a generic way of talking about the kingdom of God, basically. You're moving toward the kingdom of God, like Adam Smith's invisible hand.
Yeah.
That's like Enlightenment language talking about Christian ideas that are still hanging around. So he tried to take that dialectic and made it more about the economic dialectic, so a materialist version of it. But you asked the ultimate question because he started to run into trouble because you would ask a simple question. Wait a second, if everyone's merely the product of their system and they don't have free will, then what's the point about talking about a revolution? Nothing. Like, how could you persuade anyone? They don't have the free will to change anything. So there's this like giant, so he winds up going back a few times and trying to re-argue. And he does this with Democritus. He does it with something called a swerve. He tries to find in material reality the chance that material things could also have a free will to justify some of it. So his real philosophical system collapses in and on itself. Because in talking about there being no free will, everything materialistic and everything, it starts to negate his very promise of revolution or the world moving to a better place. Because how do you have hope if you have no control over anything?
Yeah, there's all kinds of things here. And I'm wondering, you said he's so big in our modern world. Are you familiar with the idea of universal basic income?
Yes.
So this idea that we could kind of give people money and everybody will be okay and maybe the robots will do the work. How do you see that playing out? What do you think Marx would have thought of that?
So I use this example all the time, and I'll make it really local. We have the garbage service that goes around that picks up in our community where I live. And I noticed over the last few years, it went from probably like 3 or 4, usually guys, but I've seen women too, like come by, pick up the 3 garbage cans, put them in the truck and whatever. And then over the last few years, now I see these robotic arms come down and I can grab them, throw them in, and only one person driving or 2 people driving or whatever the right amount is. So I asked myself a question. This is the perfect point again. I said, okay, so who benefits from that? So you had 4 people working, right? And no robotic arm. And now you have 1 person working with a robotic arm. So did you save money because you cut the workers out? And did they have other jobs that they were like, that you could now subsidize for them, that they didn't do that? My point is, and Marx points to this too, is that we think of progress in terms of just by on the face of it, because something progressed to go to a robotic arm, it must be better in every case. But I think that's a misnomer again, because if the culture is not in a place to replace the jobs of those workers, and this is a balance, you don't want to go crazy and keep things in the past or not progress. But I wonder, and he would use this example like with his famous articles on the Moselle, the vineyards. He wrote some really critical, I quote him in the book, where you have like people working off crops forever, and then a new machine is designed that the company owners think would be much more profitable with them, and they just pick up and leave and go to another whole crop, and you left an entire culture of generations of like orange pickers or whatever the fruit is. And is that good for the business? Yeah. Is that good for the people? No. So I still think there is something we're not quite getting, that caring for the other person is still getting lost. And we think of it always, well, isn't it always better to make profit because the profit will always come back in some way to benefit from the people? I think we're learning that's not true.
How do we assess that to know for sure?
That's a great question too. So I go back to it. I think there's no answer, but I think communities have to decide that. So it means I don't think you could have policy top down, big states like we talked about before. I think you need these are things that have to be said in dialogue with other people. So that would be more like, okay, is it, if we lose the 25 garbage people who are doing that job, do we have 25 other jobs? And if not, when do we put them on this other payroll? What about putting money toward training them to, like, it has to be in the dialogue of the real world. It cannot be abstracted. This is why I think like a stock market cannot determine the local, people. Look at the Rust Belt. I mean, to me, that's why Trump became president. I mean, you can go back to Pat Buchanan and Ross Perot, but look at the Rust Belt. That destroyed generation and probably led to the drug addiction and a lot of what we see. You took the dignity of generations of people, and you took them out, and they went for cheap labor in China, and you remove like generations of people. Like, you're not going to survive as a society doing that for sure.
So you're saying that even if, say, the stock market was rising during that time for a country, the millions of people in that part of the country were suffering.
Because it's not,
we lose that.
Does not equal, because wealth at the stock market level doesn't always translate down to wealth on like, could someone afford a home? I mean, I could think about my dad and like what his salary was compared to owning a home. And, if you need a salary, you need 5 or 10 years with your annual salary to pay for a house versus 1 or 2 years. You just think about the burden you're going to take on a mortgage. And then you're going to have 2 people needing to work. And then you're going to have to go outside the house for services to take care of the kids. And then there is a snowballing effect that I'm saying gets lost when things are calibrated in the abstract and not on the ground. So I'm with you again on the subsidiary approach to life. It has to be within a community. And I think that's what, in the ideal of this, and there's nothing simple about it, but I think in that communal way, that's what the ideal is. You have a co-op, like people who are getting to make these decisions for themselves in the real world. Yes, I think the lie of it is you're always going to have a hierarchy because people are just better at certain things. Mm-hmm. But at least as a tempering balance to the hierarchy, it could be more community involvement. Mm-hmm. So that's where civic training comes in. That's why I think education cannot be profit driven either 100%. Because people have to be educated to a certain level to even understand these things.
Yeah. So Robert, with these sort of movements that suggest change, progress, all of that, there's chaos that comes with change. People who listen to my show regularly will know that when there's chaos, manipulative people can often thrive. What do you think about people who are pushing Marxism right now, the motivations? I'm sure some are great, but what do you think is going on with this seeming swell of Marxist ideas right now?
So I think my experience has been, it's subjective, but being in Princeton, and I've always said my entire life I've lived in areas where my vote never counted, but I think they really don't know who Marx is. It's one of the reasons I wanted to write this book. Yeah. I think there's people genuinely care. If they're social, if they come from a decent life and have some moral code, they're going to care about others generally. When people care, but they're not aware of history, they're not educated in a way. I don't mean like hyper educated. I'm just like basic. Like when I say, do you know who Karl Marx is? They said, you mean Groucho? You mean Groucho? Was he Groucho or I forgot the other brother, Harpo or Groucho, So, and I'm like, yeah, I wish it was that benign, but people don't even know the basics of their history or whatever. So they wind up in a vacuum. And I think a lot of times the way to speak about something so you show that you are a virtuous person is to use the language of the time. And I think Marx owns that nomenclature a lot of time because he is speaking about social injustice. He's calling out social injustice, like how he calls it out or what you do about it and all that is another step. But it is the language. Even Alistair McIntyre, again, I bring him up, said what Marxism did is it replaced Christianity as the language you use for social justice in the modern world. So if you want to sound like someone, and I don't mean falsely, I mean like genuinely sound like someone who cares for others and wants to do something about it, Marx has given us the nomenclature of how to talk about that.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so ingrained. Once it's in the language and you have a value associated with it, you don't really need to know how accurate it is or what the real history is because it's registering in the community you're speaking to.
Yeah. So you take him in your book on this journey, sort of the inverse of Dante's Inferno.
Mm-hmm.
What are some key points along that journey that you'd like people to know more about?
Well, one crazy thing I again discovered through research is they're very similar. So Dante, you could argue that Dante sees himself as the Marx of his time because Florence is being introduced to capitalism and he sees it ruining his way of life, like his virtue ideal of his world. He also is, though he's got the tempering of the Christian worldview, he's also an idealist, and the two of them see themselves as revolutionaries of the time. Also, there's what's his name, Joaquin de Fiore, which is he's a medievalist. I think he's a monk, a Christian monk, Catholic, but he starts developing this idea of the world that it's a world's made up in dispensations, like the Christian era here and the Old Testament, New Testament moves on and there's a progression through time, and the Florence of his time is like the last modern version of it, X, Y, and Z. And it turns out Hegel and the Lutherans that train Marx pick up on these dispensationalist ideas, which is where the world spirit and the dialectical thinking picks up. So they're also both apocalyptic thinkers in that they're seeing all of the world going through a series of progressive epochs that lead to some destination. In the case of Dante, it's the beatific vision. It's God's, vision. But in the case of Marx, it's that. But I would say that, and then they're both moralists. They both are commenting on the value of people and otherwise. I just think the difference is one is binary and one is a synthetic thinker. I think Dante's a synthetic thinker, and that's a much more sophisticated, tempered, more artful way to go about life and paint worlds as he did. But he's also he's really clever too. He put a couple of popes upside down in hell, so he was commenting on his time too.
Yeah, the deepest circle of hell.
Yeah,
that's where Satan is. It's frozen. It seems to be the place of betrayers. What do you think that means?
Well, it's so interesting because when you think of hell, there's a whole. I probably did more reading on hell than you need to in a lifetime, but if you look at how hell progresses from the Bible to like medieval versions of it to Dante or whatever, hell somewhere along the way got the idea of the flames and the idea of burning and being hot. But I love the idea that Dante made it chilled and more like hell is the detachment from reality. It's almost like you've betrayed yourself. And without giving the book away, I found myself as I was writing about Marx saying, in a way, to keep his vision and to not let go of this activist obsession, he started to betray, I think, the things he really valued in his life. And I identify with this in my own life. People could do this all the time. You think that your cause and your passion should be your driven, but what you start to betray is yourself to do it, to keep hold of this idea and not let it go. So I think the chill of it in the end is almost the isolation. It's the, I'm trying to think of who the three, it's Lucifer, it's Brutus, And who's the other betrayer in his mouth, in Satan's mouth? There's one other famous
Mhm.
Brutus. Yeah, Brutus. Say loose. I forget what the three are, um, but I'm saying, like, I think the idea of hell being chilled because it's really the isolation from yourself and your inability to connect with others and be valued with others. So I portray Marx moving in that direction, getting more isolated as he gets older, and um, inability to keep friendships and connect, and what happens to his family. It's a bit of a tragedy too.
Yeah. Yeah. That idea too, that it cuts you off. I mean, to be a betrayer is to say that I will cut myself off from someone else and their goodness for my own sake. And so of course that puts you in a cold place in the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
Well,
you've detached yourself from what makes you human.
yeah.
And it's the lowest place in hell. I mean,
Right.
betraying is the lowest place in hell.
Yeah. Well, Robert Orlando, before we get to our last topic, for people who want to learn more about this stuff, learn more about Marx, as you said, would be important. Where should people look for you online?
You could go for the film that'll be coming out soon enough is marxinhell.com. You could start looking at it. We're developing a short right now that will go along as I go out and do events with the books. But the book's available on Amazon, Tan Books, pretty much all the main outlets, Barnes and Noble and otherwise. They could also look me up at robomantics.com, ROBOMANTIX.com, which is my personal website.
Okay. We'll put some links in the description for people to check out.
Mhm.
And Robert Orlando, last of all, let's talk about what's ahead for you. You're a man of so many projects. You know, what's next?
Wow. I've got one that's on the burner right now, and it's Washington's Cross, which is this year is the 250th anniversary of the country, but it's also the 250th anniversary of when Washington crossed the Delaware. But I used the play on the word Washington's Cross because there's a period of about 10 days or so with a whole series of losses. I don't know if you know the Revolutionary War at all, but he basically retreats from 25,000 soldiers in devastating retreat in the coldest time, and splits up, winds up with like 5,000 men who don't have shoes or ammunition and whatever. And for a while, he has to carry the burden of the country on his own back, where he's paying for his soldiers. He's robbing boats. He's cutting off the river, access to the river. He's running away from the British. He's being betrayed by others. He splits his army. But for a while, he's holding together alone until he finally surprises the Hessians on Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, with the famous crossing. That I really think, in the tradition of Thomas Carlyle's great men, tradition, he really does hold together a vision for a while that I think without him, the country does not survive. And I think Washington's Cross is, it's like America's crucible. It's like for a while, he's holding America's crucible of freedom together by seeing a vision when most can't, and delegating it at the right time and using his own resources to pull it out of a very desperate situation. So that's one. Apostle Paul, I mean, I write forever on him. He's kind of my forte academically. I still see him as one of the most influential figures in history, and people know very little about him too. And his ideas and I compare him a lot with Marx, and Dante actually dedicates his book to Paul. Paul and Virgil are his two mentors in the book. But I think, I got a lot going on personally and otherwise, but that's kind of on my docket right now to get that done.
Nice. Well, Robert Orlando, for these projects that help us all to see these enigmatic figures in a new light, for your book, Karl Marx, The Divine Tragedy, and for taking this interview, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed it. And you have great questions.